The eviction notice hit the table like a slap. Eliza Rowan stared at it, 3 lines of ink that had already decided her fate before she'd even read them. But it wasn't the notice that stopped her breath. It was the man who delivered it. Gerald Hatch, the county tax collector, stood in her doorway with his coat freshly pressed and his boots clean, which told her everything she needed to know. He hadn't walked. He'd ridden straight from warmth and comfort to hand her ruin, and he was smiling while he did it. "You got until Monday," he said, glancing around her cabin like he was already measuring it for someone else. "After that, the county takes the land and everything on it." "Everything?" Her voice stayed flat. She'd learned not to give men like Hatch the satisfaction of her fear. He looked directly at Hope, the Jersey cow standing in her small barn through the open door, and his smile widened just slightly. "Everything, Mrs. Rowan, including the livestock." She held the door open until he left. Then she sat down on the cold floor because her legs simply stopped working. If you've ever stood in a moment where everything decent about your life could be taken by someone who was just doing his job and enjoying it, then you already know how Eliza felt. If you haven't, stay with me, because what happened next will stay with you a long time. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Wyoming, 1879, and the decision that changed everything. The winter of 1879 came early to Laramie County, and it came mean. By the second week of November, the snow had already buried the fence posts on the north side of Eliza Rowan's property, what remained of it, and the wind had found every gap in her cabin walls with a patience that felt almost deliberate. She'd stuffed rags into the cracks the week before. The wind had worked them loose by morning. She'd stuffed them again. The wind didn't care about persistence. Neither did Gerald Hatch, as it turned out. Eliza was 31 years old, though she'd been told more than once she looked older since Thomas died. She didn't argue the point. Grief had a way of writing itself on a person's face, and she'd had 13 months of it now, 13 months of managing a homestead alone, of learning which repairs she could do herself and which she couldn't afford to hire out, of counting every coin twice before spending one. She was not a woman who frightened easily. She had set her husband's broken leg once with just a strip of rawhide and 2 fence boards, and she had done it without fainting. She had delivered a calf at 2 in the morning in the middle of a thunderstorm. She had argued a fair price with men who didn't believe women understood numbers. But she hadn't been able to argue her way out of the drought that had killed her corn, or the early frost that had taken her kitchen garden, or the fact that when Thomas died, he'd left debts she hadn't known about, small ones, scattered across 3 different merchants in town, each one coming to collect at different times over the past year, so that just when she thought she'd reached solid ground, the floor dropped again. Now the floor had dropped completely. She sat at her kitchen table with Hatch's notice in front of her and did the arithmetic for the 4th time, as though the numbers might rearrange themselves if she tried again. $47.30 in back taxes. She had $11 and some change, the sum total of a summer's worth of butter sales and the money she'd gotten for selling Thomas's extra saddle to a passing drover in September. $36 short in 6 days. She didn't cry. She'd used up crying somewhere around March. What she did instead was sit very still and think, the way she always thought, methodically, practically, without sentiment. She went through every option available to her and set each one aside as she exhausted it. She could ask the bank in Cheyenne for a loan, but she'd already tried that in September, and they'd turned her down before she'd finished the sentence. The loan officer looking at her the way men sometimes looked at widows who thought they had standing in financial conversations. She could try selling some of the furniture, but the furniture was already down to the bare minimum and would fetch maybe $5 on a good day. She could ask her neighbor Grady Willis to extend her credit again, but Grady had already done that twice this year, and she could see the discomfort in his eyes each time, the way a man looks when he's trying to be decent but knows he can't keep being decent indefinitely. There was one thing left, one asset, and it wasn't really an asset so much as the last living thing on this property that still had value, still gave back more than it took, still looked at Eliza every morning with a kind of patient trust that made her chest ache to think about it. Hope was a Jersey cow, 5 years old, copper and cream colored, with large dark eyes that caught the light in a way that made her seem almost thoughtful. Eliza had gotten her as a calf, bought her with the last of a small inheritance from an aunt in Pennsylvania, and she'd raised her through a bad winter and a difficult first freshening, and the kind of early illness that usually takes young cattle. Hope had survived all of it, more than survived. She gave good milk, rich milk, the kind that made butter worth having, and she'd been the reason Eliza had managed to keep herself in groceries through the last 3 months when everything else had failed. Selling her wasn't selling a cow. Eliza knew that. Selling Hope was the end of the last thing that was working. But she turned the idea over in her mind all that night, and by morning she had stopped thinking about selling and started thinking about trading. The difference mattered to her. A sale meant taking money and watching Hope disappear into someone else's operation, probably slaughtered within a few years when her production declined. A trade. A trade meant she could perhaps negotiate for something she needed more urgently than cash. Like shelter. Like a roof that wasn't actively trying to fall on her head. Like a situation that didn't involve freezing to death by January. She'd heard about Silas Boone. Most people in the county had heard about Silas Boone, in the way people hear about someone who keeps to himself so thoroughly that his solitude becomes a kind of rumor. He ran a cattle operation about 8 miles north of her place, a working ranch that had survived the drought better than most because he'd had the foresight to dig a second well 3 years before. She tried to remember the details people mentioned. 40 years old, maybe 42, unmarried, not unfriendly but not social either. The kind of man who showed up at the general store, conducted his business, and left without making conversation that wasn't necessary. He'd been in Laramie County for 12 years. Nobody had a bad word to say about him, but nobody had much of anything to say, period. She didn't know him. She knew of him. That was enough, she decided. Or it would have to be. She spent 2 days making her preparations. Not because the preparations were complicated, but because she needed 2 days to convince herself she wasn't walking into another version of the same mistake she'd been making all year, which was trusting that people's better nature would show itself when pressed. Gerald Hatch had certainly pressed, and his better nature had not appeared. The banker in Cheyenne had been pressed by her quiet desperation and had not been moved. Even old Grady Willis, decent as he was, had finally come around 2 weeks ago and told her gently, painfully, that he didn't think she should count on him for anything more this season. He'd offered it like an apology, but it had landed like a door closing. She brushed Hope on the morning she planned to leave, working carefully through the tangles in her tail and running the brush along her neck the way she always did when she needed to think. Hope stood patiently and chewed and breathed warm clouds into the cold air of the barn, and Eliza talked to her. Not anything meaningful, just the kind of talk you make to an animal that has earned your company, about the weather and the state of the hay and what she'd seen in the night sky before sleeping. Then she put on her good coat, which was her only coat, but she thought of it as her good one because it still had all its buttons. And she hitched Hope to the lead rope, and they walked north together toward Silas Boone's ranch, Eliza's boots leaving tracks in the snow, and Hope's breath trailing behind them, like something reluctant being left behind. It took her most of the morning to cover 8 miles through the snow. She arrived at the gate of Boone's ranch just past 11, cold through in a way that went deeper than clothing could reach, and she stood there for a moment looking at the place. It was a working ranch. Not fancy, not decorated, but solid in a way that her homestead hadn't been in years. The fences were in good repair. The barn was properly chinked. There was smoke from both the main chimney and a smaller one at the back of the house, which meant he had enough wood that he didn't have to be economical with it. She noticed all of this the way a person notices things when they are calculating what they have to offer against what they need. She opened the gate and walked up to the front door and knocked. The man who opened it was taller than she'd expected. He had the kind of face that had been weathered into something that might once have been handsome and was now just genuine. All the softness worn away, leaving something more honest underneath. He looked at her, and then at Hope, and then back at her. And he didn't say anything immediately, which she found unsettling. "Mr. Boone," she said, "my name is Eliza Rowan. I homestead. I have a homestead about 8 miles south. I wondered if I might have a few minutes of your time." "You walked 8 miles in this," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes." He stepped back from the door. "Come in out of the cold, then." She hesitated. She'd expected negotiation first. A porch conversation. Some kind of professional distance while they established terms. She hadn't expected to be immediately let inside, which felt like it skipped several steps of the arrangement she'd planned in her head. "The cow can go in the barn," he said, as though that also had been decided. "She looks cold, too." Eliza followed him in, mostly because she didn't have a good reason not to. The inside of the ranch house was plain. No curtains, no decoration to speak of, a table and chairs that were functional and nothing more. But it was warm in a way she hadn't felt in months. Not just heated, but the kind of deep-in-the-walls warm that comes from a well-built structure, something that held the heat rather than bleeding it out through every surface. She felt her shoulders drop approximately an inch, which she hadn't realized she'd been holding them up. He put coffee on without asking whether she wanted it. She supposed if you walked 8 miles through November snow, you probably wanted coffee, and he wasn't wrong. "Mr. Boone," she said, remaining standing, because sitting felt like a concession she wasn't ready to make yet. "I'll be direct with you. I have a situation." "All right?" "I have a tax debt on my property. $47 due Monday. I have 11. I've exhausted my other options." She kept her voice level with some effort. "I came to propose a trade." He set the coffee pot back on the stove and looked at her. He had steady eyes, gray-green, the kind that didn't move around much when they were looking at something. "What kind of trade?" he said. "The cow." She got it out clean, like pulling a splinter, quick because slow would be worse. "Her name is Hope. She's 5 years old, Jersey, good producer. She's worth more than $47 on any fair market. I can't pay my taxes in cash, but she can be worth cash to someone who needs milk cattle. And She stopped, took a breath. "I need a place to live through the winter. A room, somewhere I won't freeze. If you have space, I'd work for it. I can cook, I can clean, I can do any labor you need done. I'm not asking for charity. I'm proposing an exchange." Silas Boone was quiet for a moment, in the way that some people are quiet while they're thinking, and other people are quiet while they're deciding whether to be honest. Then he said, "I don't want your cow, Mrs. Rowan." She felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. This was the version she'd been afraid of. Not the straightforward refusal, but the kind that came with conditions she hadn't anticipated. "The cow is the best thing I have," she said carefully. "She's a fair trade for what I'm asking." "I don't doubt that." He poured the coffee and slid a cup toward her side of the table. "I'm saying I don't want to take her. I have a room here. It's not much. It was storage. I cleared it out last spring, meaning to do something with it, and didn't. You can have it. The barn's got space for your cow." He paused. "There's no trade I'm interested in making." Eliza looked at him. "What do you want in return?" she said. "Because people don't offer rooms without conditions. I've learned that." Something moved in his expression. Not offense exactly. More like recognition. The look of a person who has seen a thing enough times that they understand why someone else would assume it. "What I'd like," he said, "is for someone to make some use of that milk. I had cattle, but I don't keep dairy animals. If you're willing to put what you get from her toward the household, that's useful to me. But I'm not calling it payment. I'm calling it—" He seemed to search briefly for the right word. "Practical." "That's it," she said. "That's the whole arrangement. That's it." She stared at him for a long moment. She was trying to find the catch, the angle she hadn't seen yet, the favor he'd call in later, the control disguised as generosity. She'd become expert in that specific kind of looking over the past year, and she still couldn't find it here. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "I know you walked 8 miles in the snow to try to save your land instead of giving up on it," he said. "I know you tried to trade your best possession instead of asking for a handout. I know you're standing in my house still looking for the trap in a fair offer." He drank his coffee. "That tells me enough." She should have felt relieved. Some part of her did feel relieved, a small, suppressed part that she didn't quite trust yet. The larger part was still watching, still measuring, still waiting for the moment when this turned into the thing she'd expected it to be. "I'll bring my things tomorrow," she said at last. "If that's—" "Bring them today," he said. "Weather's coming. You don't want to be making that walk again tomorrow." She opened her mouth to argue that she was perfectly capable of deciding when she made the walk. Then she looked out the window at the sky, which had gone the particular shade of flat gray that meant he was right, and she closed her mouth again. "Today, then," she said. She went back out to get Hope settled in the barn and to walk back to her cabin one last time for her things. And the whole 8 miles she turned the conversation over in her mind like a puzzle she couldn't solve, not because anything he'd said had been wrong, but because she'd been certain, deeply, practically certain, that generosity in a world like this one didn't exist without a price hidden somewhere in the fine print. She hadn't found the fine print yet. She wasn't sure that was the same thing as it not being there. By the time she returned to Boone's ranch that afternoon with everything she owned packed into one trunk and a canvas bag, the snow had started coming down hard, exactly as he'd predicted, and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. She stood for a moment in the yard before going inside, the snow landing cold on her face, and she thought about her cabin standing empty 8 miles south. The drafty walls, the failing roof, the land that was already as good as taken. Then she thought about Gerald Hatch's smile. Then she picked up her trunk and went inside. The room he'd set aside for her was small, barely 10 feet square, with one window that looked out on the north side of the barn and a narrow cot against the wall. There was a hook for clothing and a small chest with a candle on it. It was less than what she'd had. It was warmer than anything she'd had in months. She set her things down. She sat on the edge of the cot. She listened to the wind press itself against the walls and find nothing, not a single gap, not one place to get through. She did not let herself feel grateful. Gratitude felt like debt, and she already had too much of that. But she sat in the warmth of that solid room, and she breathed, and after a while she took out the letter she'd been carrying in her coat pocket since October. A note from Thomas she'd found tucked behind a loose board in the cabin, written in his handwriting. Just a few lines, nothing important. And she held it in her hands without opening it. She'd made it through one more day. Tomorrow she would figure out what to make of Silas Boone. Tonight, she was simply going to be warm. Outside, the snow came down without mercy, the way Wyoming winter always did, indifferent to what you deserved, indifferent to what you'd lost, indifferent to whether you survived it or not. But inside this house, with its properly chinked walls and its deep-in-the-bones warmth, Eliza Rowan sat very still and thought about what it meant that a man she didn't know had given her a room without asking for her dignity in return. She didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time in 13 months, she thought she might want to find one. Part 2. Lưu ý: viết đủ 60.635 từ liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện và hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ ba, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình, viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sàng. Có yếu tố con người, cấm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau, chấm câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document, trai đấn bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyện. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật, không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu, lưu ý đặc biệt quan trọng. Nếu đạt đến giới hạn trả lời, không được dụng giữa câu hay viết nốt câu đó hoàn chỉnh không mở rộng nội dung. Show more she had expected in those first few days that the arrangement would feel like what it was, a transaction with the paperwork left unsigned. She had expected to keep to her room, do her work, stay out of his way, and maintain the careful emotional distance that had kept her functioning since Thomas died. She had expected Silas Boone to eventually reveal himself as something she recognized, a man who collected favors like others collected debt, patient and quiet until the bill came due. She had expected a lot of things. What she had not expected was that he would knock on the door of her room on the second morning and ask whether she preferred her coffee with milk or without it, and then stand there genuinely waiting for the answer as though it mattered to him. Milk, she said, because it was true, and because the question had caught her completely off guard. He nodded and went back to the kitchen. When she came out 10 minutes later, there was coffee with milk on the table, and he was already outside tending the horses, and he had not made a single comment about the fact that she now had a cow in his barn who could provide that milk, or about the convenience of the arrangement, or about anything at all. He had just made the coffee and left it there. She sat down with it and felt deeply suspicious. The first week established a rhythm that neither of them had explicitly discussed, and both of them seemed to fall into with a kind of cautious practicality. Eliza rose before dawn. She always had. There was no unlearning that. And she went to the barn to milk Hope before the temperature dropped any further in the early morning. She brought the milk in, separated the cream, started the butter when there was enough cream to work with, and began whatever was needed for breakfast. Silas ate without comment, which she initially interpreted as indifference, and later came to understand was simply how he was. A man who didn't fill silence for the sake of filling it. He was gone most of the day. He had cattle to manage across 3 different parcels of land, fence line to check after every storm, and the constant particular work of a working ranch in winter, which is mostly the work of keeping things alive that winter would prefer to kill. He came in at midday sometimes and sometimes didn't. He came in at dark without fail, removed his boots at the door. She noticed this, how he always removed his boots at the door without being asked, and washed his hands before sitting down. She cooked. Not because it was owed, but because it was practical, and because it gave her something to do that had visible results, which she needed right now. The cooking at her own cabin had been meager for months, small portions of the cheapest ingredients, making herself eat enough to keep working, but not enough to feel like she was spending freely on herself. Here, with a proper larder and actual supplies, she found herself cooking the way she had when Thomas was alive, when there had been a point to making something good. She did not examine that feeling too closely. It seemed like something that could be easily damaged by too much attention. On the 4th day, she churned the first butter and set it out in a covered crock and didn't say anything about it. The next morning it was half gone, and Silas hadn't mentioned it either. That evening he came in from the cold with a package from the general store. Sugar, she discovered when she opened it, and a small tin of baking powder. And he set it on the kitchen counter and said, "I figured you might be running low." And she stared at the package for a moment because she had been running low. She had been planning to make do without, and she hadn't told him that. "How did you know?" she said. "I looked in the larder," he said, without any particular apology for having done so. She considered being annoyed about this, and then decided she wasn't, quite, and that annoyed her slightly more. "You should have said something," she told him. "I would have told you what was needed." "I was going to town anyway," he said. "It wasn't trouble." This was, she was beginning to understand, how Silas Boone operated. He saw what was needed, and he addressed it, and he didn't make a performance of having done so. It was a quality she might have found admirable in someone she trusted, but in someone she was still evaluating, it was disorienting, because it removed all the usual signals she relied on to understand a person's motives. She was accustomed to generosity that announced itself, that expected acknowledgement, that kept a running tally even when the tally was never spoken aloud. His version didn't announce itself at all. It just appeared, quietly, like snow. She didn't know what to do with that. She started watching him more carefully after that, not obviously, but the way she had always been observant, taking in details from the side of her vision, cataloging things, building a picture. She watched how he handled the ranch hands when they came by. There were 2 of them, Cobb and a younger one named Reyes, who worked part-time in the winter and would come back full-time in spring. He was direct with them, not unkind, but not soft either. He paid them on time, she noticed, because Cobb mentioned it once in passing, the mild, surprised gratitude of a man who had worked for people who didn't. He fixed things himself when he could, rather than leaving them for others. He didn't complain about the weather, the conditions, the price of hay, or anything else, though Cobb complained about all of these things at length, and Silas simply listened without agreeing or disagreeing. He was, she concluded after 2 weeks, either genuinely what he appeared to be or extraordinarily patient. She could not yet determine which. The first real conversation, not the transactional exchanges about coffee and supplies, but an actual conversation, happened on a Sunday evening in the 2nd week of December, when the storm outside was bad enough that neither of them was going anywhere, and both of them had run out of separate tasks to occupy themselves with. She was mending one of his work shirts, which had a tear along the sleeve that he'd apparently been ignoring for some time. The edges of the tear were worn, meaning it had been that way for weeks at minimum, and he was at the other end of the table doing accounts by lamplight, and the silence had gone on long enough that it had changed quality, from comfortable to something slightly more weighted. "How long did you have the homestead?" he asked, not looking up from the ledger. She kept her eyes on the mending. 4 years. Thomas filed the claim the spring before we married. We went out together that fall. "From where?" "Indiana. Terre Haute." She paused. "I thought Wyoming would be—" She stopped, chose a different word. "Bigger." He did look up at that briefly. It is big. I meant, she wasn't sure how to explain what she'd meant, that she had imagined the bigness as freedom, and discovered that freedom and emptiness looked very similar from the inside of a failing homestead. I meant I thought the size of it meant more room to make mistakes and recover from them. He was quiet for a moment. Sometimes it does, he said. And sometimes the size just means there's more distance between you and help when things go wrong. It was the most she'd heard him say at one time. She looked at him, but he'd gone back to the ledger. Is that what happened to you? She said, and immediately felt she'd gone too far. He didn't seem to take offense. No, he said. Things went right for me out here, more often than they probably should have. He paused. I was lucky with the water situation. Dug the second well on a hunch and turned out to be the right call. Could just as easily have been wrong, and then I'd be in a different position than I am. But you're not. No. She went back to the mending. Outside, the wind hit the north wall hard enough to rattle the window in its frame, and then retreated and hit it again. The man who delivered the tax notice, she said. She hadn't planned to say it. Gerald Hatch. He looked at Hope like he was already thinking about what she'd sell for. Silas put down his pen. He does that, he said carefully. He's done it to other people. Has anyone stopped him? Once or twice, when they had the money and the standing to push back. He looked at her steadily. Most people don't have both. I had neither, she said. I just had a cow. And you still have her, he said. That's not nothing. She didn't answer that. She finished the seam on his shirt sleeve and bit off the thread and folded it and set it on the table between them. It wasn't nothing. She knew it wasn't nothing. But sometimes knowing a thing and feeling it were two different distances from each other, and she was still crossing the ground between them. The gossip reached her on a Thursday, 12 days after she'd arrived, which was about as long as she'd expected it to take. She had gone to the general store in town, Millhaven, the nearest settlement of any size, about 4 miles from Boone's ranch, to collect a few things that were needed. She had gone on her own, which was a deliberate choice. She had no intention of using Silas as a buffer between herself and the world, and she'd been managing her own transactions in that store since she and Thomas had first arrived. The storekeeper, a practical man named Farwell, had treated her decently enough over the years, and he was decent enough now, but there were 2 women at the far end of the counter when she came in, and they went quiet in a particular way that told her the conversation had been about her. She bought what she needed. She kept her face neutral. She was almost to the door when she heard one of them, Mrs. Alderman, she recognized the voice, a woman whose husband ran the largest cattle operation south of town, say to the other, not quietly enough. She moved herself right in, just like that. I don't know what Silas was thinking. The implication was clear. She was being positioned as either predatory or desperate, depending on which version of the story the listener preferred, and both versions shared the same basic assumption, that a woman living under a bachelor's roof could only be doing so under terms that were not entirely proper. She went back out into the cold and walked to where she'd tied the horse Silas had lent her, another uncomplicated transaction on his part, another complication for her to process, and she stood for a moment with her hand on the animal's neck and decided how angry she was going to allow herself to be. Quite angry, she concluded, but not visibly angry. Visible anger in this situation would be read as confirmation of something. She told Silas that evening because it seemed better to tell him directly than to have him hear it secondhand, which he would, because Millhaven was small and secondhand information moved faster than horses. She told him plainly, the way she'd told him everything, what she'd heard, who'd said it, what the implication was. He listened without interruption. Then he said, I know Margaret Alderman. She's been interpreting other people's arrangements to her own satisfaction for 20 years. She was wrong about most of them. Being wrong doesn't slow her down much, Eliza said. No, he agreed. It doesn't. It puts you in a position, she said, having me here. I want you to understand that I understand that. If you need me to... She wasn't sure how to finish the sentence without implying she was offering to leave, which she wasn't prepared to do with 5 inches of snow on the ground, and 6 days still left before she even knew whether her taxes had been covered. She stopped and started over. I'm not going to pretend I don't know what people are saying. Silas was quiet for a moment in that particular way of his, not uncomfortable, just taking time to get the words in the right order. What they're saying, he said finally, is their business. What goes on here is ours. I made an offer and you accepted it, and the terms are what they are, and I'm not in the habit of adjusting what I do because Margaret Alderman has an opinion about it." He paused. "You don't have to defend the arrangement to anyone. I won't be defending it either, because it doesn't need defending." She looked at him carefully. "That's easy to say from where you're standing. Your reputation isn't the one that pays a different price for this." He held her gaze. "You're right," he said, and the straightforwardness of that stopped her for a moment, because she hadn't expected him to simply agree. "It's not fair. The way it works out here isn't fair, and I know that. But I can tell you what I intend to do, which is make it clear to anyone who says something to my face that you're here under an arrangement that's honest and decent, and that if they've got a problem with it, they can bring it to me." He paused. "It won't fix the whispers, but it might slow them down." 2 days later, she found out he'd done exactly that. Cobb mentioned it in passing, with the slightly odd tone of someone reporting something they'd witnessed unexpectedly. Silas had been in town, at the feed store, and Walt Alderman, Margaret's husband, a large and self-important man who reflected his wife's opinions back at the world like a mirror, had made some remark, casual and plausibly deniable, about the domestic situation at Boone's ranch, and Silas had stopped what he was doing and looked at him and said, in a voice Cobb described as very quiet and very final, that Mrs. Rowan was a woman of complete integrity under his roof by mutual honest agreement, and that Walt could either keep his comments to himself or bring them somewhere they could be properly addressed. Walt had kept his comments to himself. Eliza heard this second and third hand and sat with it for a long time. She didn't know whether to be grateful or uncomfortable. She landed somewhere in between, which felt about right for most things where Silas Boone was concerned. The middle weeks of December were the coldest, and also, unexpectedly, the ones that began to shift something between them. Not dramatically, not in any single moment, but in the accumulated way that small things do when there are enough of them. She noticed that he didn't give her instructions. He had opinions about how things should be done, she could tell, but he stated them as preferences rather than requirements, and then let her do things her own way and didn't comment on the difference. She noticed that he fixed the loose board on the porch step without mentioning he'd done it, so she only found out because one morning she went out and the step didn't give the way it had been giving, and she had to stand there for a moment and recalibrate. She noticed that he listened, not just waited for his turn to speak, but actually listened, when she said something, and that he remembered details of things she'd mentioned in passing, so that a conversation from 3 days ago would occasionally surface in something he said now. She noticed that she was starting to notice these things, and that the noticing had changed character. She had started out cataloging him the way you catalog a potential threat. She was no longer doing that, and she wasn't sure exactly when she'd stopped. Thomas had been a good man. She believed that fully, without revision. Grief had not revised her memory of him into something simpler or better, but it hadn't made her bitter either. He had been affectionate and occasionally careless and funny when the mood was right and not particularly good at forward planning, which had contributed to the debts she hadn't known about, though she did not hold the debts against him because she understood they had come from optimism rather than deceit. She had loved him with the comfortable certainty of something built slowly, and his absence had not been a dramatic wound so much as a constant low-grade one, a pressure behind the sternum that she had learned to work around. She was not thinking about replacing that. She was not, she told herself firmly on several occasions, thinking about anything along those lines at all. She was thinking about surviving the winter and resolving the situation with her land and building something stable. That was enough to think about. But she also found herself, on an evening about 3 weeks in, telling him about Thomas without intending to, just one detail leading to another in the way of conversation when the guard comes down slightly. She told him about the calf that became Hope, and how Thomas had thought she was making a mistake buying a sick calf, and how she'd stayed up 3 nights watching that calf when it was uncertain whether it would make it, and how when it made it Thomas had laughed and said she'd been right, and he'd been wrong and said it plainly without making her pull it out of him, and how that had been one of the things she'd loved best about him. Silas listened. When she finished, he said, "He sounds like a man who knew when he was wrong." "He did," she said. "He wasn't always right about knowing when he was wrong, but when he figured it out, he said so. That's rarer than it should be." "It is," Silas said. She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them was burning low and needed trimming, and she'd been meaning to do it all evening and kept forgetting. In the low light she looked away. "I don't talk about him much," she said. I find it's easier not to, with most people. You don't have to, Silas said. But you can. She nodded. She reached over and trimmed the lamp, and the light came up, and the room went back to what it was, the ordinary warmth of a kitchen table in winter. Two people who had fallen into each other's lives sideways, and were still figuring out what to make of it. The Sunday before Christmas, she went to milk Hope in the morning and found that the cow had knocked over the water bucket in the night. Not unusual, she did this occasionally, and had been standing without water for some hours. Eliza refilled the bucket and stood with her hand on Hope's neck while she drank, talking to her quietly, and in the midst of that quiet conversation, she looked around the barn at the other cattle Silas kept, healthy and well-fed, the hay properly stacked, the stalls clean, and she thought, not for the first time but more clearly than before, that this was a man who took care of things. Not because someone was watching, not because it built a reputation, because that was how he was made. She was still standing there, hand on Hope's neck, when she heard the barn door and turned to find Silas coming in with his coat on. "Thought you'd been out here a while," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just an observation, the kind someone makes when they've started noticing your patterns. "She knocked the water over," Eliza said. "I was making sure she drank enough." He came and stood at the stall gate and looked at Hope with the evaluating eye of a man who knows cattle. "She looks good," he said. "Better than when you brought her." "She doesn't like the cold," Eliza said. "She never has. But she does better with enough water, and she eats steadily so." She paused. "She was my last good decision," she said, not really meaning to say it out loud. Everything else over the past year felt like I was making it up as I went and mostly getting it wrong. But keeping her, that was the right call every time. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You also made the call to come here." She looked at him. "That was a good decision too," he said, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an arithmetic result rather than offering a compliment. She didn't know what to say to that. She turned back to Hope and adjusted the blanket she'd put across the cow's back for warmth, tucking it at the edges, buying herself a moment. "I'm still not sure about that one," she said finally. "Ask me in the spring." "All right," he said, without any indication of what he thought about having to wait for the answer. He checked the latch on Hope's stall and found it slightly loose, and produced a tool from his coat pocket. She was beginning to suspect he always had tools in his coat pocket, and tightened it without a word. She watched his hands while he worked. They were not gentle hands. They were large and marked from years of hard use, with a scar along the outside of the left one that she hadn't asked about. But they were careful hands. There was a difference. "Silas?" she said, and the use of his given name surprised her as much as it apparently surprised him, because he looked up. "When you offered me the room," she said, "that first day, did you know what you were taking on?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I knew it would be complicated," he said. "I didn't know how complicated, but I don't think I needed to." "Why not?" "Because complicated isn't the same as wrong," he said. "And it was the right thing to do. I was pretty sure of that." She nodded slowly. She didn't have a follow-up question to that. It was, she thought, the most honest thing anyone had said to her in over a year, and it had the particular quality of honesty that makes you want to sit with it for a while rather than immediately respond. They walked back to the house together through the cold morning, and neither of them said anything more. And the snow came down as it always came down in Wyoming in December, without ceremony, without pause, without the slightest interest in what was being decided below it. But something was being decided. She could feel it the way you feel a change in the weather before it arrives, in the pressure of the air, in the stillness before the wind shifts. She couldn't have named it precisely. She wouldn't have tried. She went inside and started breakfast and did not let herself think too hard about why the kitchen, that morning, felt more like hers than the homestead had felt in a year and a half. That afternoon, a rider came up the road from town at a speed that meant news, and Eliza was in the yard when he arrived, and she saw by the look on his face, young man, one of the courthouse runners, that the news was not good, and her stomach dropped before he even pulled the horse to a stop. He had a notice. Official, stamped, from the county office. Her taxes. She already knew before she read it. The auction date had been moved up. Not Monday. Friday. 2 days. She stood in the yard with the paper in her hand and felt the ground shift under her the way it had been shifting all year. Not dramatically, just that slow, inexorable tilt, like the whole world had been put on a slant and everything she tried to hold on to kept sliding. Silas had come out of the barn by then. He read the expression on her face before he read the paper, and she handed it to him because her hands were doing something she needed them to stop doing, and she turned away for a moment and looked at the fence line and breathed. 2 days, she said, when she could say it steadily. Yes, he said. He was reading the notice, not her, and she appreciated that. The mercy of being allowed to collect yourself without an audience. I'm $36 short, she said. She already knew the number. She had known it for weeks. But saying it out loud in front of another person made it real in a different way, the kind of real that has weight. He folded the paper carefully and held it for a moment. Eliza, he said. Don't, she said immediately. Not harshly, but clearly. He stopped. I know what you're going to say, she told him, and I need you to understand that I can't. It's not pride. Well, it is partly pride. But it's also that if I owe you money on top of the room and board and everything else, she stopped. I won't be able to think straight in this situation if I owe you everything. I need some part of this to still be mine. He was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved between them, and the paper crinkled slightly in his hand. I hear you, he said. She looked at him. Do you? Yes, he said. I hear you. She waited for the but, for the practical argument, the gentle overriding, the reasonable explanation of why she was being irrational. It didn't come. He folded the notice again, creased it once more, and held it out to her. She took it. I need to go to town tomorrow, she said. I want to talk to the courthouse myself, see if there's any avenue I haven't thought of yet. I can drive you, he said, if you want. Not I'll drive you, if you want. Yes, she said. All right. She went inside and sat with the notice and thought for 3 hours with the methodical precision of a woman who has learned that panic is a luxury she can't afford. She thought of every option, however unlikely. She thought of the butter money she'd accumulated, $11, which hadn't changed because her needs hadn't changed. She thought of the jewelry she no longer had, sold 6 months ago. She thought of her father's people back in Indiana, who she hadn't been in contact with in 4 years, and who would not, she was honest with herself about this, respond in time even if she wrote. At the end of 3 hours, she had the same $11 and the same $36 gap and 2 days. She went to bed in her small room with its one window looking out on the barn, and she lay in the dark and listened to the wind, and she was not, she found to her own surprise, crying. She had moved past the place where crying was the response. She was somewhere quieter and colder than that, a place where you simply look at a problem until it's all the way seen. She had fought for this land. She had bled for it, not dramatically, not in the storytelling sense, but the ordinary bleeding of hard work and sacrifice and choices that cost something real. She had given this land a year of herself that she would not get back, and in 2 days it was going to belong to someone else. She stared at the ceiling of Silas Boone's small spare room, and she thought about Thomas, and about hope, and about the sound of Silas's voice saying complicated isn't the same as wrong, and she thought about what it meant to fight for something and lose it anyway, and whether the fighting had still been worth doing. It had been. She believed that. It didn't make it easier. Nothing about any of this was easy, and she had stopped expecting easy sometime around March, and had not started expecting it again. She closed her eyes in the cold dark and held the thought of the butter-warm kitchen and the sound of a barn latch being tightened by careful hands, and she held it carefully, the way you hold something you're not sure you get to keep. Tomorrow she would go to town. Tomorrow she would try every remaining thing, and whatever happened after that, she would face it the same way she had faced everything else this year, on her feet, with her eyes open, and without giving anyone the satisfaction of watching her fall. She was up before dawn the next morning, which wasn't unusual, but she was dressed and ready to leave before Silas had even come in from the morning check on the cattle, which told him something without her having to say it. When he came through the door and found her already in her coat with her $11 in her pocket, and Thomas's letter tucked inside her boot because she'd taken to carrying it there for reasons she didn't examine, he simply turned around and went to hitch the wagon. She had wanted to feel ready for this. She had spent half the night constructing the arguments she would make at the courthouse. Reasonable ones, organized ones, the kind that demonstrated she was not a woman who fell apart under pressure, but a woman who had a plan and needed only the time to execute it. She had rehearsed the conversation with the county clerk in her head until it ran smooth. She had told herself that there was still a possibility here, some avenue she hadn't tried, some provision in the law or some allowance in the process that could buy her the days she needed. By the time Silas brought the wagon around and she climbed up, and they started down the frozen road toward Millhaven, she had mostly stopped believing her own arguments. But she was going to make them anyway, because the alternative was not going. They didn't talk much on the drive. The cold was serious that morning, the kind that made conversation feel wasteful, and Eliza sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the road and thought about what she would say and in what order and what she would do if none of it worked. Silas drove and didn't fill the silence, and she was grateful for that, specifically and consciously grateful, because she had been in enough situations over the past year where someone felt obligated to talk her through her difficulty and had only succeeded in making her feel more alone. The county clerk's office in Millhaven occupied a corner of the courthouse building, a squat structure that smelled of old paper and the particular cold that settles into stone buildings in winter and refuses to leave regardless of the fire in the stove. The clerk was a man named Burley, 50-ish, with the slightly pained expression of someone who had spent 20 years delivering bad news inside a warm office and had developed a careful professional sympathy for it. Eliza laid out her situation without preamble. The debt, the amount, what she had, what she lacked, and the 2 days between now and the auction. She kept her voice even and her eyes on his face, and she did not apologize for taking up his time. Burley listened. He was, she gave him that, a man who listened completely before he spoke. "Mrs. Rowan," he said when she finished, "I understand your position. I want to be direct with you about what the options are because I don't think it does you any good for me to talk around it." He folded his hands on the desk. "The auction date is set by statute. I don't have the authority to move it. The only way to stop the auction is full payment of the outstanding debt before Friday at 9 in the morning." "Is there any provision for partial payment?" she said. "Any arrangement where I pay what I have now and guarantee the remainder within 30 days. "Not under the current statute, no." He paused. "I've seen that proposed in other counties. It hasn't passed here." "Is there anyone with the authority to make an exception?" "The county commissioner could, theoretically, intervene, but Commissioner Hale is in Cheyenne until the new year for the legislative session. His deputy doesn't have that authority." "And Gerald Hatch?" Something shifted in Burley's expression, very slightly, the flicker of a man choosing his words. "Mr. Hatch administers the collection. He doesn't have the authority to waive or defer it." "But he has the ear of the people who do." Burley was quiet for a moment. "I wouldn't know about that, Mrs. Rowan." She looked at him steadily. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who knew exactly what he was not saying and was not going to say it. "All right," she said. She stood up. "Thank you for being direct." "I'm sorry I don't have better news," he said, and she believed he meant it, which somehow made it worse. She came out of the courthouse into the cold and stood on the steps and let the air hit her face, and she stayed very still for a moment, the way you stay still when the last real option has just closed, and you're taking stock of where that leaves you. Silas was waiting by the wagon. He read her face when she came down the steps. "Nothing," she said. It wasn't a question she was answering. She was just saying it out loud so it was real. "Nothing," he confirmed quietly, because he'd known before she went in and hadn't said so, which was the right call. She stood by the wagon and looked at the street, at the general store across the way, at the feedlot at the far end, at the smoke coming from the chimneys of Millhaven's decent citizens who were warm inside their established lives. And she felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but was somewhere in the dense, uncomfortable territory between them. "I want to go to the homestead," she said. He looked at her. "I want to see it," she said. "Before Friday. Before it's not mine to see." He didn't argue the point or suggest it was a bad idea or offer his opinion on whether it would help her. He just picked up the reins and turned the wagon south. The homestead looked smaller than she remembered, which didn't make sense because she'd only been away 3 weeks and houses don't shrink. But grief has its own geometry, and the cabin she'd been fighting to save seemed to have contracted in her absence, hunched down into the snow like something defeated, the roofline sagging worse on the east end than she'd realized, the gap in the south wall where the wind had found its way through visible even from the road. She got down from the wagon and walked across the yard alone. She didn't ask Silas to come with her, and he didn't follow, which she appreciated in the particular way you appreciate someone who understands the shape of a moment they're not part of. The door had swollen with the cold, and she had to put her shoulder into it. Inside, the cabin was below freezing. She could see her breath, could see the crust of frost on the interior wall where the moisture had gotten in. The furniture she'd left behind, the heavy table, the 2 chairs, the iron stove she couldn't move alone, sat exactly as she'd left them, waiting with a patience that objects have that people don't. She walked through it slowly. She was not crying. She had made a decision about that before she got out of the wagon. She was looking, taking an inventory of the place as it actually was, not as she'd been holding it in her memory. The roof over the sleeping area had failed worse than she'd thought. There was daylight visible through the boards in one corner, snow on the floor below it. The south wall was bowing outward slightly, pressure from the accumulated winter weight on the frame. The stove door was warped, had been warping for 2 years, would need replacing before the stove was safe to use through another winter. She stood in the middle of the main room and looked at all of it and thought, this is what I almost died keeping. It wasn't nothing. This land was real, good land, properly watered, with the creek running along the north edge and the south-facing slope that caught the best of the winter sun. The land was worth saving. The structure on it had been fighting the land for years and losing. She had not let herself think that before. She had thought of them as the same thing, the homestead as the land, inseparable. But standing in the cold ruin of the cabin, she understood that they weren't the same. The land would still be the land regardless of whether this structure stood on it. The land would still be worth something after this building was gone. She went back outside. Silas was standing by the fence line, looking at the north pasture, giving her the space of not watching the door. She crossed the yard and stood beside him, and looked at what he was looking at, which was 160 acres of Wyoming winter, snow-covered and still, with the creek line visible as a dark thread across the north edge, and the mountains in the distance doing what they always did, which was be enormous and indifferent. "It's good land," he said, not looking at her. "I know," she said. "Worth more than the debt on it." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Eliza, I need to say something, and I need you to hear it without deciding what it means before I finish." She turned to look at him. His profile was set against the gray sky, and he was looking at the land, not her, and she had the sense of a man measuring his words very carefully. "I have the money," he said. "What you're short, I can pay it before Friday. The land stays yours. I'm not asking for any part of it, not a piece of it, not any claim on it. I'm not talking about a loan with terms because I know how you feel about terms. I'm not talking about adding it to what you owe for the room." He paused. "I'm talking about paying a debt because it's right that the debt gets paid, and you shouldn't lose this land because the calendar moved up and you didn't have $36. She had expected this. She had told herself she expected this, and that she knew what she would say. She had the answer prepared. And then she stood in the cold air next to this man and felt the prepared answer dissolve, and what replaced it was something harder and more complicated. "I told you last night," she said. Her voice was careful. Not cold, but careful. "I know what you told me last night," he said. "I'm not arguing with the reason. I'm asking you to hear me out before you say no." She waited. "I know what it costs you to accept help," he said. "I've watched you for 3 weeks operating from the assumption that everything given has a price attached, and the price is always some version of your independence. And I know where that comes from because you've told me enough that I can put it together. Hatch and the bank, and the things that didn't work out, and the people who helped in ways that left marks. I'm not pretending I don't understand why you've got that wall up." He turned then and looked at her directly. "But I need you to understand that paying this debt doesn't give me any purchase on you. It doesn't create an obligation I intend to collect. It doesn't make you mine in any sense of the word." He held her gaze. "What it does is let you keep land that's rightfully yours. That's all it does." She looked at him for a long time. The wind came across the pasture and moved between them, and she felt it on her face, and she thought about Thomas saying he'd been wrong and saying it plainly. And she thought about the lamp trimmed without her asking, and the sugar bought without being told, and the step fixed without being mentioned. "You'd be spending money you need for your own operation," she said. "Yes." "It could put your spring plans back?" "It could." "And you'd do that?" "I would." She looked away. She looked at the cabin, the sagging roof, the bowed wall, the daylight through the boards, and she looked at the land around it, the good flat land and the creek line and the south-facing slope. "I need to think," she said. "All right. I need to think without you looking at me while I do it." He turned back to the fence line. She walked away from him, across the yard, to the place where the garden had been, or where she'd tried to make a garden. 2 years of trying and 2 years of the Wyoming weather doing what it wanted regardless. She stood in the dead garden, and she had an argument with herself that was one of the more honest arguments she'd ever had, because there was no one else to have it with. On one side, she had told herself and told him, and built her entire sense of herself around the premise that she would not be beholden in a way that reduced her, that she would not trade her freedom for someone else's charity and call it rescue. On the other side, this was not the same as what she had been afraid of. She could feel the difference. She could feel it the way you feel the difference between a held hand and a grip. They look similar from the outside, but the sensation is entirely distinct. On the first side, once again, feelings weren't arguments. Feelings were what people used to talk themselves into things they'd later regret. On the other side again, she had been letting fear make her decisions for 13 months, and most of those decisions had been correct, and some of them had been wrong. And she was standing in a dead garden in December because of the sum total of all of them, and maybe it was time to let something other than fear weigh in. She stood in the garden for a long time. Then she walked back to where Silas was standing. "I'm going to say yes," she said, "and I'm going to need you to understand something about why." He turned. "It's not because I can't manage without it," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I have managed badly and expensively and in ways I wouldn't recommend to anyone, but I have managed. It's not because I don't have other options. I don't have other options right now, but I have found options before when I thought there weren't any." She made herself hold his gaze. "It's because I believe you mean what you said, about no purchase and no obligation, and I've been wrong about people before, which means I could be wrong about you. But I don't think I am. And at some point, you have to decide whether you're going to let what happened before determine everything that happens after. And I've decided I'm not." He was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then he said, "I meant what I said." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm saying yes." They drove back to town in the same quiet they'd come in, but it was a different quiet. Not the silence before an outcome, but the silence after one, the kind with weight and texture rather than absence. At the courthouse, Eliza stood beside Silas while he paid the clerk. She had insisted on being there. She had not wanted this to happen without her present and witnessing, not as oversight, but as participation. This was her debt being paid, and she intended to watch every cent of it. Burley took the money with the professional composure of a man who had seen the situation reverse itself at the last moment before, though not often. He made the notation in his ledger with deliberate care. He stamped the receipt twice. He handed it to Eliza, not to Silas, because she was standing closer, and because she had been the one in his office that morning, and perhaps because he understood, on some level, whose transaction this fundamentally was. She held the receipt in her hands, $47.30, paid in full, and the land was hers until she decided otherwise. She had expected to feel relief. What she felt instead was something more complicated, a thing that had relief in it, but also something rawer, something that had to do with having been seen clearly by another person and not found wanting, and how unfamiliar that felt, and how much it cost her to admit how unfamiliar it felt. She folded the receipt and put it in her coat pocket next to Thomas's letter. They drove home without talking about it. She was aware of that, the not talking about it, and she was aware that Silas was doing it deliberately, not leaving it unacknowledged, exactly, but not pressing on it either. He had said what he'd said at the fence line, and he'd meant it, and he wasn't going to circle back and make sure she'd understood, which she was grateful for in the same way she was grateful for all the other things he didn't do. Back at the ranch, she went straight to the barn to check on Hope, which was what she always did when she needed to not be somewhere for a few minutes. She stood with her hand on the cow's neck and breathed in the warm barn smell and let herself feel, privately and without audience, what she hadn't let herself feel at the courthouse or in the wagon. She felt it move through her in a wave, not grief exactly, and not joy exactly, the release of something held under pressure for a very long time, the way a breath releases when you've been holding it so long you forgot you were holding it. She didn't cry, but it was close. She stood with her face against Hope's neck and let the wave pass, and then straightened up and adjusted the blanket across the cow's back and went back to the house to start supper. Silas was at the table with papers when she came in. He didn't look up immediately, and when he did, he looked at her with the same expression he always had, direct, steady, not performing concern, and then looked back at his papers, and that was all. And it was exactly right. She made supper and they ate it, and the conversation was ordinary, whether the temperature was going to drop further before the week was out, whether the north fence needed attention after the last storm, and the ordinariness of it was not a deflection of what had happened that day, but a kind of acknowledgement of it, because people who can talk about fence lines after a significant moment are people who trust that the significant moment doesn't need to be performed to be real. She washed the dishes, and he dried them, which he'd started doing 2 weeks ago without discussion, and when they were done, she went to her room and sat on the edge of the cot and looked at the receipt and the letter, both of which she'd laid on the small chest. 2 pieces of paper that were somehow the sum of where she'd arrived. The receipt meant the land was hers. The letter meant Thomas was still with her in the only way he could be now. And the room she was sitting in meant that something she hadn't expected was happening to her, slowly and without her permission, in the way the most important things usually happened. She did not sleep easily. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle in the cold, the small sounds of a well-built structure responding to the temperature, not complaining but adjusting, the way solid things do. She thought about the conversation at the fence line and the specific way he had said what he'd said, without flinching from it, without dressing it up. I'm not talking about a loan with terms. It doesn't give me any purchase on you, just the facts of it, laid out straight, because he was a man who apparently believed that the truth didn't need decoration. She thought about what she'd said in return. At some point, you have to decide whether you're going to let what happened before determine everything that happens after. She had meant it as an explanation of why she was accepting his help, but lying in the dark, she understood it meant something wider than that, and she wasn't entirely sure she was ready for how wide it went. Sleep came eventually, as it always did, and when it came, she slept soundly for the first time in weeks. The sleep of someone who has moved from one kind of uncertainty to another, but has at least moved, which is its own strange comfort. The next morning was Thursday, one day before the auction that was no longer happening. She went to milk Hope before dawn and found Silas already in the barn, which was unusual. He normally did his barn rounds later. He was checking the rear hoof on one of his cattle, a cow that had been favoring her left side for 2 days, and he was bent over with the hoof between his knees working at whatever had gotten lodged there with a pick, talking quietly to the animal. He didn't hear her come in over the wind. She stood in the doorway for a moment and watched him work. The patience of it, the steady murmuring talk to a cow who couldn't understand the words, but responded to the tone, the careful way he set the hoof down when he'd finished, so the animal could adjust her weight gradually rather than dropping it all at once. She thought, this is who he is when no one is watching. She must have made some sound because he turned then and straightened up, not startled exactly, but recalibrating. "Stone," he said, by way of explanation, holding up the pick. "She'll be fine." "Good," Eliza said. She moved to Hope's stall and began the milking, and they worked in parallel in the dark barn, the sounds of early morning around them. Wind at the boards, cattle shifting, the rhythmic work of her hands, and somewhere outside the first birds beginning. After a while he said, without preamble, "I want to ask you something. You don't have to answer it." She kept milking. "All right. When you decided to come here, to the ranch, the first day, was there any version of you that thought it wouldn't work? That you'd show up and I'd be—" He paused, choosing. "Not what you needed." She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about anything. "Every version of me thought that," she said. "I came anyway because I was out of choices." "And now?" She looked at him across the barn, at the man standing in the half-dark with a hoof-pick in his hand, and the steady eyes and the scar on his left hand. "Now, I'm not sure I'd call it running out of choices," she said. "I think I'd call it making one." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, once, the way he always acknowledged things that mattered without making a ceremony of it, and he went back to checking on the cow with the sore hoof, and Eliza went back to milking Hope, and the barn held them both in its ordinary warmth, while Wyoming did what Wyoming always did, which was go on regardless. Later that morning, she took the receipt to the courthouse alone. Silas offered the wagon, and she said she'd rather walk, which she knew was stubborn, and she did it anyway because some stubbornness is worth keeping. She walked the 4 miles to Millhaven with the receipt in her pocket, and she filed the payment confirmation with Burley, who stamped it again and handed her the final copy with the look that she chose to read as something warmer than professional. She was on her way out when Gerald Hatch came in. He didn't see her at first. He was at the counter with papers of his own, talking to the junior clerk in the tone of a man accustomed to being heard without having to raise his voice, and she was almost to the door before he turned and their eyes met. He looked at her, at the paper in her hand, at the stamp on the paper. His expression shifted through something quickly, surprise, recalculation, and then a kind of enforced neutrality, the face of a man adjusting to information he hadn't anticipated. "Mrs. Rowan," he said, not warmly, but not with the casual possessive certainty he'd had the day he'd delivered the notice. "Mr. Hatch," she said. She held the door open, not long, not pointedly, just the ordinary half-second of someone leaving. And then she went through it and let it close behind her, and she stood on the steps of the courthouse in the cold December air with the paid receipt in her hand, and she felt, for the first time in over a year, that the ground under her feet was level. Not safe, not finished, not simple, but level. She walked back to the ranch the long way, along the creek road because she wanted the time, and because the light was doing something beautiful on the snow that she didn't have a word for but wanted to be present for anyway. By the time she came through the gate and up the road toward the house, the afternoon was tilting toward evening and the lamps were already lit inside, yellow squares of warmth against the cold gray of the sky, and she could smell wood smoke and something cooking. He'd started supper, apparently, which was not his usual practice, and she stood outside for a moment before going in, just looking at it. It was not her house. She was clear about that. The receipt in her pocket was for land 8 miles south, land with a cabin that had daylight coming through the roof, land she now owned free and clear and would have to figure out what to do with. But standing outside this house in the failing December light, with the smell of wood smoke in the air and the lamp burning in the window, she thought about what it was, exactly, that made a place feel like a place you belonged. She had assumed, for 4 years, that it was ownership, the deed, the filed claim, the thing you had on paper. She was no longer entirely sure that was right. She went inside. Silas was at the stove with his back to the door, and he said without turning, "Figured you'd be cold," and handed her a cup of coffee over his shoulder without looking, and she took it, and the coffee was too hot to drink immediately, but she held it in both hands and felt the warmth move through her palms, and she thought, this, not the paper, not the $47 paid and settled and documented in Burley's ledger. This. The ordinary, impossible warmth of being in a place where someone expected you back. She sat down at the kitchen table with her coffee and the receipt, and Thomas's letter, and the quiet company of a man who didn't need to fill the room with himself. And outside the Wyoming winter came down hard as it always did, and inside the ranch held against it, solid and unapologetic, the way it had held against everything else. She had survived the day. She had survived the month. She had survived the year. What came next, she did not yet know. But for the first time in a long time, not knowing felt less like falling and more like standing at the edge of something, looking out, deciding whether to step. Christmas came to the ranch the way it came to most working places on the Wyoming frontier, without ceremony, without particular acknowledgement, and with the same chores that came every other day of the year, because cattle didn't observe holidays, and neither did cold weather. Eliza noticed the date on the morning of the 25th the way she'd noticed most things lately, practically, with a brief private acknowledgement, and then back to what needed doing. She had not celebrated Christmas in any meaningful way since Thomas died. Last year she had spent the day alone in the drafty cabin with a pot of beans and the particular silence of a house where someone used to be. This year she was in a warm kitchen with butter browning in a pan and the smell of the coffee she'd already made. And outside she could hear Silas in the yard talking to Cobb about something to do with the north pasture fence, their voices carrying in the cold air with the flat clarity that very cold mornings produce. She had made biscuits. This was not a Christmas gesture. She made biscuits most mornings because they were practical and filling and because she'd gotten good at them years ago and the skill hadn't left her. But she'd made an extra batch this morning, and she'd used the good preserves she'd found in the back of the larder, a jar of something someone had put up the previous summer, plum or something close to it, and she'd set them on the table without comment. When Silas came in and sat down and saw the biscuits and the preserves, he looked at them for a moment and then at her. "Merry Christmas," she said, because it was, and because she had decided that she was going to stop treating ordinary kindnesses as things that needed to be explained away. He was quiet for a moment in the particular way that sometimes meant he was moved and didn't want to make a production of it. Then he said, "Merry Christmas, Eliza," and poured his coffee and ate 3 biscuits with the preserves and didn't say anything more about it. But something in his face had changed, slightly, in the way faces change when something expected to be one thing turns out to be another. Cobb had come in by then, stomping his boots at the door, and Reyes behind him, and they'd eaten too. And for an hour the kitchen had a kind of warmth in it that had nothing to do with the stove, the warmth of people occupying a space together without agenda, the uncomplicated human warmth of a meal shared on a cold morning. When they left and the kitchen was quiet again, Silas stayed at the table with his second cup of coffee rather than going straight out to the day's work. She was washing the dishes with her back to him when he said, "I have something for you." She turned. I was holding, somewhat awkwardly, a paper-wrapped parcel about the size of a thick book. He set it on the table in front of the empty chair across from him without looking at her directly, which she understood to mean he felt uncertain about it, which was a thing she hadn't seen from him before. She dried her hands and sat down and looked at the parcel and then at him. "You didn't need to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "Open it." She unwrapped it carefully. She always unwrapped things carefully. An old habit, the habit of someone who'd learned not to waste anything that could be reused, and inside the paper was a ledger book, the kind used for accounts. New, with a green cloth cover and clean white pages, and inside the front cover he'd written in his cramped, precise handwriting, "Eliza Rowan, Dairy Operations, 1880. She looked at it for a long moment. "You're planning ahead," she said. Her voice came out slightly thicker than she intended. "You've been keeping track in your head," he said. "The butter sales, what hope produces, what the operation could look like if it grew. I've heard you thinking through it at supper. You need a proper ledger if you're going to do this right." She had been thinking through it at supper. She hadn't realized she'd been doing it out loud, or enough out loud that he'd been tracking it. She looked at the clean white pages and thought about what it meant that he'd been listening to her half-formed plans with enough attention to give them a physical object to live in. "Thank you," she said, and meant it without qualification, which was not something she did often. He nodded and picked up his coffee and looked out the window at the yard and said, "I've been thinking about the south pasture," which was his way of moving on without making her sit in the moment longer than was comfortable, and she was grateful for it and told him so by responding to the comment about the south pasture, and that was their Christmas. It was, she reflected later, one of the better ones she could remember. January arrived the way January always arrived in Wyoming, by making December feel temperate by comparison. The temperature dropped to places that were difficult to think about practically, and the snow came horizontal on the worst days. And the work of keeping the ranch functioning in those conditions was the kind of work that uses you up completely and leaves nothing for anything else. She and Silas fell into something during those weeks that she didn't have a name for and didn't try to give one. It wasn't routine exactly. It was more specific than that, more intentional, though neither of them was being intentional about it consciously. It was the accumulation of small choices made consistently, the coffee always made, the fire always tended, the end of the day always arriving with both of them in the same warm room, tired in the particular way of people who have worked hard and can rest because the work is done. She started talking to him differently during January. Not about different things, necessarily, but in a different way. Less filtered, less preceded by the internal calculation of what was safe to say. She told him about her mother, who had died when Eliza was 16 and left a gap that had never entirely filled. She told him about the year before she met Thomas, when she'd been working in a dry goods store in Terre Haute and had thought, with some seriousness, that this was what the rest of her life was going to look like, and how she'd felt about that. Not devastated, but settled into something smaller than she'd imagined herself in. She told him about the night she'd set Thomas's broken leg, and how the whole time she was doing it she'd been furious, not at Thomas, but at the fact that there was no one else there, no one to hand things to or to help hold, and how loneliness had a way of choosing the most inopportune moments to make itself felt. He listened to all of it. He offered things in return, not in a transactional way, not as exchange, but in the natural rhythm of conversation between people who are actually talking, rather than simply occupying the same space while talking. He told her about coming west at 28, with enough money to start something small, and the specific terror of the first winter, when he'd been certain he'd made a catastrophic mistake and had spent 3 months talking himself down from going back east. He told her about a woman he'd thought he might marry 6 years ago, who had decided that Wyoming was not what she'd signed up for and had been right to decide that, and how he hadn't blamed her and had been lonelier than he'd admitted to anyone for about 2 years after. He told her these things plainly, without making them into stories with clean lessons attached, and she valued that specifically, the willingness to say something true without shaping it into something prettier than it was. She was falling in love with him. She knew this the way you know something you've been resisting knowing, not as a revelation, but as an admission, finally, of something that had been waiting for her to catch up to it. She didn't tell him. She wasn't ready to tell him, and she wasn't sure the telling was the point yet. What she did was keep working, keep cooking, keep taking care of Hope, and thinking about the dairy operation in the ledger he'd given her, and building the plans on the clean white pages a little more each week. The plans were becoming real. That was the thing she hadn't expected, that the ledger would do what it was supposed to do, which was make the vague ideas concrete and the concrete ideas legible. She'd been selling butter to Farwell at the general store for 2 months now, small amounts but consistent, and he'd mentioned twice that he could move more if she had more to sell. With Hope, she was limited. With 2 dairy cows, 3, ideally, she could supply Farwell's store consistently and perhaps make arrangements with the hotel in Mill Haven, which went through butter at a rate that the current local supply didn't meet. She laid this out for Silas one evening in the second week of January, the ledger open between them on the table, walking him through the numbers she'd been running. Not asking permission, not proposing partnership yet, just thinking out loud in the way she'd apparently been doing for weeks without realizing it, except this time deliberately. He studied the numbers with the seriousness he brought to anything that was actually being proposed rather than just discussed. The startup cost is the cattle, he said. Yes. 2 good dairy cows, probably $60 to $80 each at fair market. You have the land to graze them. She paused. The homestead land. It's yours, he said, paid and clear. It's 8 miles south and the cabin is barely standing. The cabin isn't what you'd be using it for, he said. The pasture is good. I know that land. I've seen it. It could carry 4 or 5 dairy cattle without stress. She looked at him. You're telling me to use the homestead land for the dairy operation. I'm telling you it's an option you have, he said carefully. What you do with it is your decision. She sat with that for a moment. The homestead had been, in her mind, a separate problem she hadn't resolved yet, something she owned but didn't quite know what to do with, too damaged to live in and too valuable to simply leave. Using it as pasture land for a dairy operation wasn't how she'd been thinking about it. But there it was, 160 acres of good Wyoming ground with water access, sitting 8 miles south while she made plans in a ledger at someone else's kitchen table. It would require moving the cattle back and forth, she said, thinking it through, or having someone manage the southern pasture. Cobb's looking for more steady winter work. His usual arrangements fell through this year. You've thought about this, she said. Some, he said. She looked at him across the ledger. How much of what you said just now was you thinking about what's good for your operation versus what's good for mine? He held her gaze steadily. Some of both, he said. I'm not going to pretend they're completely separate. If you have a dairy operation that's producing well, that's useful to this ranch, fresh dairy close by, someone managing the southern pasture land that I've been leaving underused because I don't have enough cattle to run up there efficiently. He paused. But the reason I've been thinking about it is you, not the ranch. You. She looked at the ledger, at the numbers she'd written in her own handwriting across the clean white pages, at the name on the front cover, Eliza Rowan, Dairy Operations, 1880. I need to think about it, she said. Take all the time you need, he said, and turned to the south pasture fence problem he'd been meaning to get to before the next storm, and that was that. She thought about it for 3 days, which was approximately how long it took her to stop arguing with herself and start working through the practical questions, which was always the sign that she'd actually decided something and was in the process of accepting the decision. On the 3rd day, she told him she was going to sell the homestead. He looked at her with the attentive stillness he brought to important things. Sell it, she said again, not because I have to, because I want to. Because keeping it means keeping one foot in a place that almost killed me, and I'm done with that. She had thought carefully about how to say this, and had decided the direct way was the only way. I'll use the sale money to buy the dairy cattle. I'll keep the operation here, run it out of your barn and your pasture with your agreement, contribute to the ranch accordingly. And I'll do it as, she paused, as an arrangement between equals, not as a tenant, not as someone you're doing a favor for, as someone who is bringing something to the table and expects to sit at it on the same terms as the person across from her. Silas was quiet for a long moment. That's what I'd want, he said. For the record, that's what I'd want this to be. Then we're agreed, she said. We're agreed, he said. She put her hand out. He looked at it, and for a moment something moved in his expression that wasn't businesslike at all. Something warmer and less contained than his usual composure. Something that she felt in her chest before she could analyze it. Then he took her hand and shook it, the firm handshake of a person taking a thing seriously, and held it 1 second longer than a handshake strictly required before letting go. She looked at the table. He looked at the window. Outside, the wind did what it always did, and neither of them said anything for a moment. And the moment was full of something neither of them had put into words yet, but that was present in the room as surely as the wood smoke and the lamplight. The sale of the homestead happened faster than she'd expected, which she later thought she should have anticipated, because good land in Laramie County went quickly when it was priced honestly, and she'd priced it honestly. A family from Ohio, the Petersons, husband and wife and 3 children, the exact same category of hopeful westward moving people she and Thomas had been 6 years ago, came through Millhaven in the second week of February looking for land to file on, and Farwell had told them about hers, and they'd ridden out to see it and made an offer within the week. She drove out to meet them. She met the wife first, a woman named Clara, who was perhaps 25 and had the expression of someone who had committed to something large and was working very hard to be sure it was the right decision, and Eliza recognized that expression with a precision that made her chest tighten. She showed her the land, walked her through the pasture and along the creek line, and explained the water situation and the sun exposure of the south-facing slope. And she did not misrepresent a single thing, including the state of the cabin, which she described accurately and completely, and which the husband looked at with the practical eye of a man who knew how to rebuild things and said he'd seen worse. They agreed on a price that was fair. Not generous, not exploitative, fair, which was what she'd wanted. She signed the papers in Burley's office on a Tuesday afternoon, Silas beside her because she'd asked him to be there this time. Not as witness in any legal sense, but as the person she wanted present when she closed this chapter, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Burley stamped the transfer documents with his customary double stamp and handed her the money, and she held it in her hands, $112, the most money she'd held at one time in 2 years, and she felt something released that she hadn't known was still held. She didn't look back at the homestead on the drive home. She had said goodbye to it properly when she'd walked through it in December, had stood in the ruined kitchen and acknowledged what it had cost her and what it had failed to give her, and had said what needed to be said in the way of internal goodbyes that don't require an audience. She was done with it now. What was left was forward. The dairy cattle came from a ranch 40 miles north, a man named Ellerby, who kept a mixed operation and was looking to reduce his dairy stock before spring because he was moving toward beef exclusively. 2 Jerseys, both healthy, both currently producing, both well-tempered by Eliza's assessment when she went with Silas to look at them. She paid $62 each and drove them back herself, with Silas riding alongside, and the whole drive back she kept looking at them and doing the arithmetic in her head, what they'd produce, what that translated to in butter and cream, what butter and cream translated to in dollars at Farwell's current rate, what that figure looked like expanded by the hotel arrangement she was going to propose next week. She had names for them before they reached the ranch. Constance and Ruth, which were her mother's name and her grandmother's name, because it seemed right to name the beginning of something after the women who'd made her possible. Hope took the new arrivals with the mild bovine assessment of an established animal evaluating newcomers. A sniff, a long look, some repositioning in the stall hierarchy, and by morning the 3 of them were settled together in a way that suggested the arrangement would work, which was all you could ask of cattle, or, for that matter, of most things. Eliza wrote the new numbers into the ledger that night, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, Silas reading at the other end. The names of the cattle, what she'd paid, the date, the projected first-month output, the arrangement with Farwell, the proposed terms she'd present to the hotel. She wrote it all in the careful columns she'd been developing over the past weeks, the ledger filling up with the record of something being built. And she let herself feel, the specific satisfaction of a plan becoming real through the accumulated weight of action taken consistently. "I want to ask you something," she said, without looking up from the ledger. "All right," Silas said. She kept writing for a moment, finishing the line she was on, putting the period at the end of it. "When I came here in November," she said, "I thought I was making a temporary arrangement, something I'd get through and then move on from." She set the pen down. "I don't think that anymore." He had put down his reading. She could feel his attention the way you feel someone looking at you even when you're not looking back. "What do you think now?" he said. She looked up at him. "I think I'm building something here, not temporarily. And I think—" She stopped, started again. "I think you know that, and I think you've known it longer than I have. And I think it would be dishonest, at this point, to keep pretending I haven't noticed what's been happening between us since about the second week of December." The silence that followed was the particular kind of silence that has a great deal in it. Silas looked at her steadily, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen in quite this form before. Not the composed steadiness of his usual expression, but something more open than that, something that had let down one of its walls. "I didn't want to push it," he said. "You'd been pushed enough." "I know," she said. I know. And I'm not saying you should have. I'm saying I'm telling you now because it's true, and because I don't see the point of not saying true things anymore." "What are you saying exactly?" he said, and his voice was careful, and she understood the care. That he was not going to assume, not going to run ahead of what she actually said, because he was a man who listened to the exact words and didn't fill in what he wanted to be there. "I'm saying that I came here with a cow and nothing else," she said, "and somehow I've ended up with—" She gestured slightly, a small movement that took in the ledger and the room and him and all of it. "This. And I don't know exactly what this is or exactly where it goes, but I know it's something I want to keep, and I think you do too." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes." And it was one of those answers that's exactly the right size for the question. No excess to it, no performance, just the clean single syllable of something true. She held his gaze and felt something settle in her, the way things settle when they've been held at an uncertain angle for a long time and finally find their level. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. She picked up the pen and went back to the ledger because the numbers still needed finishing, and he went back to his reading, and the kitchen held them in its warmth the way it had been doing for 2 months now. The two of them, ordinary and imperfect, and increasingly, irrefutably, belonging to the same place and the same future. That was not the end of the hard parts. She knew that. She was not a woman who believed in the end of hard parts, because the frontier had been thorough in its education on that point. There would be bad years and difficult negotiations, and mornings when everything went wrong before breakfast, and evenings when she was too tired to feel anything except tired. There would be disagreements. She could already see the shape of the ones they'd have, the places where her stubborn independence would collide with his own fixed certainties, and something would have to give. None of that was the end of the world. She had learned to tell the difference between the kind of difficulty that means something is broken and the kind that means something is being built. And this was the second kind. She finished the ledger entry and closed the book and looked at the name on the front cover. Then she took a clean piece of paper from the pile she kept near the lamp and wrote at the top, in her precise handwriting, "Spring Plans." Below it she wrote, 3 cows. Farwell arrangement, hotel proposal, South Barn expansion, Higher Cobb seasonal. Then she paused and wrote one more line, smaller than the rest, at the bottom of the page where it wouldn't interfere with the practical list above it. Figure out the rest as you go. She looked at it for a moment. Then she folded the paper and tucked it into the front of the ledger and went to get the last cup of coffee from the pot before it went cold. Silas looked up when she moved. "Do you want the last of it?" she asked, holding up the pot. "Yes," he said. "Thank you." She poured it and set the cup in front of him and picked up her own and sat back down. And outside the February wind pushed against the solid walls and found nothing, as it always found nothing. And inside the lamp burned steady, and the fire held, and the night was long and cold and theirs. She had stopped waiting for the floor to drop. She had not decided the floor was permanent, or that the future was assured, or that anything was simple. She had simply decided, with the same practical clarity she brought to cattle prices and butter yields and ledger columns, that she was going to live in this life, the one in front of her, rather than the one she'd been bracing against. It was not a small decision. It had taken her the better part of 4 months to arrive at it, and it had cost her things she hadn't expected to pay. But she had paid them, and she was here, and the ledger was full of plans, and across the table the man who had given her a room when she had nothing to offer but a cow, and her own exhausted determination was drinking his coffee and reading his pages and not asking anything from her except what she was willing to give, which, she was finding, was more than she'd thought she had. Spring was still weeks away. There was more winter to get through, and the work of it was real and unromantic, and would continue to use her completely on the worst days. But the light was already changing. She'd noticed it that morning, the particular slant of it through the east window that was different from January's light. Something in the angle that said the year was turning even if the temperature hadn't agreed yet. She finished her coffee. She looked at the closed ledger and the lamp and the man across from her and the dark window behind him with the stars visible between the clouds, cold and very far away, and completely indifferent to what was being decided in this kitchen. She was glad, she thought, that she had walked 8 miles in the snow. She was glad that the floor had dropped, because falling was how she'd found this. She did not say any of this out loud. She didn't need to. She simply sat in the warmth of the thing she'd built from nothing, and she let herself have it, and that was enough. Spring came to Laramie County. The way it always came. Reluctantly, in pieces, with several false starts that raised your hopes and then buried them under 6 more inches of snow before finally, unmistakably, committing to warmth sometime in the 3rd week of March. Eliza noticed the exact day winter broke. She was in the barn with Constance and Ruth and Hope, doing the morning milking, and she heard a sound on the barn roof that wasn't whined, a soft percussion, irregular, the sound of meltwater finding its way off the eaves and dropping to the ground below. She stopped what she was doing and listened to it for a full minute. Then she went to the barn door and pushed it open and stood in the gap and felt the air, which was still cold but a different cold than it had been, a wet cold. A cold that had something alive in it rather than the dead freeze of January. And she looked at the mountains in the distance with the first visible change in the snow line, and she thought, there it is. She went back to the milking, but she was smiling when she did it, which Hope seemed to find suspicious, because the cow turned her head and looked at her with the mild bovine skepticism she reserved for anything outside the normal routine. It's spring, Eliza told her. Don't look at me like that. The hotel arrangement had come through in the 3rd week of February, sooner than she'd expected. She had walked into the Millhaven Grand, which was not grand exactly, but was the largest establishment in town and served a regular clientele of travelers and commercial men who expected certain standards, and had asked to speak with the proprietor, a practical woman in her 50s named Mrs. Gale, who had listened to Eliza's proposal with the focused attention of someone who recognized a reasonable business offer when she heard one, and had no patience for the preamble people usually wrapped around them. The terms they'd agreed on were straightforward. Eliza would supply 12 pounds of butter per week, minimum, at a fixed price per pound with a renegotiation clause at 6 months. Mrs. Gale had asked 2 pointed questions about consistency and reliability, and Eliza had answered them directly and without overselling, and Mrs. Gale had extended her hand across the desk and said, "Monday deliveries before 10." And that had been that. She had walked out of the hotel and stood on the boardwalk in the February cold and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Something she almost didn't recognize at first because it had been absent for so many months. It wasn't relief. It wasn't the particular exhausted gratitude of someone who has avoided disaster again. It was something cleaner and more forward-facing than that. It was confidence. Not the brittle kind she'd been performing for a year, the performed competence of someone terrified of being seen to fail, but the real kind, grounded in something she'd actually built. She told Silas that evening. He listened and said, "Good," and then asked about the per-pound rate she'd negotiated. And when she told him, he nodded with the approving expression of a man who knows the market and recognizes a fair price secured, and she found she valued that specific response more than she would have valued effusive congratulations, because it treated what she'd done as business rather than as miracle. By March, the operation had a shape. 3 cows, consistent production, 2 accounts. Cobb managing the additional labor 2 mornings a week at an arrangement that worked for everyone. The ledger had grown dense with entries, not just the financial ones, but the operational notes she'd started adding, the things she was learning about dairy management at this scale that she hadn't known before and was figuring out by doing. She'd made errors. She'd overestimated output in the first cold week and underdelivered to Farwell and had to have an honest conversation with him about it and adjust the following week's arrangement. She'd made a decision about feed rationing that hadn't been right and had caught it early and corrected it. But the 2 days between the error and the correction had cost her more sleep than she liked to admit. None of it had been smooth. All of it had been hers. Silas had watched her manage these things without involving himself unless asked. That was the most important thing he did, and she wasn't sure he knew it. He didn't hover. He didn't offer the unsolicited opinion of a man who thought he knew better. When she asked him something, a specific question about an animal's health or about a contact at the county fair who bought dairy products in quantity, he answered specifically and then left it with her. And when she didn't ask, he left that with her too. They were not, in February, what they were going to become. They were still in the careful stage, the stage where both of them knew what was there but were moving toward it thoughtfully, rather than rushing, the way you move toward something you don't want to break by reaching for it too fast. There had been evenings at the kitchen table that ran long past what either of them needed to sit up for. Conversations that wandered from practical things to the other kind without a clear moment of transition. There had been the night in late February when she'd come in from a difficult hour with Ruth, who had a minor infection in one teat that Eliza had been treating with careful attention, and she'd been cold through and more tired than she'd realized. And Silas had taken one look at her and handed her a blanket without a word, and heated the coffee without being asked, and sat across from her while she collected herself. And she had thought at that moment, this is the person I want sitting across from me when things are hard. Not because he fixes it, because he's there. She hadn't said it that night, but she had filed it precisely and without ambiguity in the place where she kept the things she knew to be true. The proposal, if you could call it that, which it was, though it didn't announce itself in those terms until it was already happening, came on a Sunday in the middle of March, the day after the barn roof announced the end of winter. They had been talking about the South Barn expansion, which was a real and necessary project. The current barn could not comfortably support more than 4 dairy cattle, and if the operation was going to grow the way the numbers suggested it could, they needed more space before summer. Silas had drawn a rough plan on the back of an old piece of paper. She kept finding these, his rough plans, in places around the kitchen, never presented formally, just sketched and left where they might be useful, and they'd been discussing materials and timing and whether Cobb and Reyes could handle most of the labor with the two of them helping, or whether they'd need to bring in someone additional. And then, in the middle of a sentence about the materials cost for additional stall space, Silas stopped. She looked at him. He was looking at the drawing, and then he looked at her, and something in his expression had changed. The composure was still there, but it had become deliberate rather than natural, the look of a man who has decided to say something and is making himself say it. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "And I want to be clear that I'm not asking because it's practical or because it would simplify the arrangement. I'm asking because I'd like you to be my wife. Because I—" He stopped, found the word he wanted. "Because I would choose this. I would choose you. And I want to know if you'd choose me." She looked at him across the rough drawing of a barn expansion on the back of a piece of scrap paper, in a kitchen that had been a stranger's kitchen 4 months ago and was now the center of everything she was building, and she thought about all the ways she could respond to this, the careful responses, the measured responses, the responses that protected something that didn't need protecting anymore. "Yes," she said, "I'd choose you." He exhaled slightly, and she realized he had been holding some tension in him that she hadn't detected, which told her something about how much the question had cost him. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. Then they went back to talking about the barn, because the barn needed to be built, and the materials wouldn't price themselves. And this was who they were. People who could have a life-altering conversation and then return to the practical work in front of them without needing to make a ceremony of the transition. She found she loved that about them, about the specific shape of them together. They married in April, when the ground had thawed enough to feel like spring, and the kitchen was warm from the outside in, rather than from the fire out. It was not a large event. Eliza had not wanted large, and Silas had never wanted large, and the result was something that fit them exactly. A handful of people, the kitchen table moved to accommodate chairs, Farwell and his wife, Cobb and Reyes. Old Grady Willis, who had driven out from his place and arrived looking like a man who had worried about her for months and was visibly relieved to find her well, and Mrs. Gale from the hotel, who came because Eliza had invited her on impulse, and who turned up in a good dress and sat in the back and left promptly after, which was entirely in character. The justice of the peace was a man named Aldred, who did this perhaps 6 times a year in various living rooms and kitchens across the county, and had the slightly rushed efficiency of someone with a long list of places to be, but who managed, in the moment itself, to slow down enough to say the words like they meant something. Eliza wore her good coat, which still had all its buttons. She had sewn a small piece of ribbon onto the collar because it was her wedding, and ribbon was not extravagant on a wedding, and Silas wore his cleanest work clothes and had made an evident effort with his hair, which had not entirely cooperated, and she found this detail, the hair that had not cooperated, more moving than she could have explained to anyone because it was so precisely him, not performing a version of himself for the occasion, just himself, with slightly less success than usual at the hair, showing up to marry her. When it was done and Aldred had shaken their hands and accepted his fee and departed, Grady Willis came to her with his hat in his hands, and his eyes wet at the edges in the way of old men who have decided they are done being embarrassed about feeling things. "I'm sorry I couldn't do more, Eliza," he said. "Last fall. I'm sorry I had to cut you off the way I did." She looked at him, this decent, limited, genuinely remorseful man who had done what he could for as long as he could and had told her the truth when he reached his limit, which was more than most people managed, and she felt the last residue of the bitterness she'd been carrying thin away completely. "You did what you could," she said, "and where it led me turned out to be the right place, so I can't hold it against you." He looked like a man who had been given something he hadn't earned and knew it and was grateful for it anyway, which was the right response to grace, and she meant what she'd said, which was perhaps the most remarkable thing about it, that she meant it entirely, without remainder. Margaret Alderman was not at the wedding. Her husband, Walt, was not at the wedding. Their absence was noted by everyone present and commented on by no one, which was the right call on everyone's part. The whispers hadn't stopped entirely over the winter. Small towns do not stop whispering. It is one of the permanent conditions of small-town life. But they had changed in quality, the way whispers do when the thing they're whispering about persists and refuses to be what the whispers said it was. By March, even Margaret Alderman had apparently found other arrangements to interpret because the comments reaching Eliza secondhand had largely dried up. She did not need their approval. She had stopped needing it sometime in January, which was progress she hadn't noticed making until it was already made. The opinion of people who had decided who she was before they knew her was not something she had the energy for anymore, and she had made peace with that in the practical way she made peace with most things, by simply removing it from the list of things she spent herself on. The spring and summer were the hardest work she had ever done, and also the best. The barn expansion happened in May, 4 men and 2 weeks of work, and it went wrong twice. Once when the lumber shipment came short, and they had to wait a week for the remainder, which cost them time. They didn't have easily to spare, and once when a section of framing had to be pulled down and restarted because the angle was wrong, and Silas caught it before they'd gone further and called it out, which led to a tense afternoon involving raised voices between Silas and Cobb that she stayed out of entirely until it got resolved, and then made supper large enough to signal that she was pretending it hadn't happened, which everyone appreciated. When the barn was done, it was solid and functional, and approximately what the drawing on the back of the scrap paper had suggested, which was all a barn needed to be. The 2 new stalls were occupied within a week. Hope moved into the corner stall she seemed to prefer, the one with the eastern light in the morning, and Constance and Ruth settled on either side of her with the easy familiarity of animals who have spent a winter together, and 2 new cows, both Jerseys, both purchased from Ellerby again, because the first 2 had worked out, and there was no good reason to change what was working, filled the remaining space and looked around at their new surroundings with the calm and curiosity of cattle who have been moved before and accepted as one of the conditions of their existence. Eliza stood in the new barn on the evening after the last cow arrived and looked at all 5 of them and did the arithmetic in her head, the way she always did, and the arithmetic was good. Not comfortable, not settled. They were still in the building phase, still in the years where everything went back in before anything came out. But the numbers told a story she recognized, a story moving in the right direction, and she let herself feel the particular satisfaction of that without immediately qualifying it. She had written to her younger sister Ruth in Indiana in February, not to the extended relatives she'd lost contact with, but to her actual sister, the one with the same grandmother's name as the cow, a coincidence that made Eliza smile every time she thought about it. The letter had been difficult to write, not because she didn't know what to say, but because there was so much of it, 18 months of living that she hadn't written about, and now had to compress into something that didn't read like either catastrophe or fairy tale, both of which it had been at different points. She'd written 3 drafts and sent the 4th, which still ran to 6 pages and covered the winter and Silas and the dairy operation and the paid taxes and the sold homestead and the marriage proposal, in that order, because chronology felt more honest than thematic arrangement. Ruth had written back in April with a letter that contained 15 questions arranged in the slightly aggressive order of someone who reads fast and thinks faster and has strong feelings about the answers she expects to receive, and Eliza had laughed reading it, actually laughed, the real kind, and Silas had looked up from the ranch ledger and said, "Good news?" "My sister writes like I think," Eliza told him. "Then she's probably exhausting," he said, and went back to the ledger, and she laughed again at that, which she appreciated because it was true, and he said it without making it a complaint. Ruth came to visit in August, had saved the train fare over spring and summer, and arrived with 1 trunk and the specific expression of a woman who has been curious about something for months, and is finally in a position to satisfy that curiosity without having to take anyone else's word for it. She was 26, with Eliza's same economy of movement and their mother's brown eyes, and she stayed 3 weeks, and was useful in ways Eliza hadn't expected but should have, because they'd been raised by the same woman and learned the same skills, and Ruth recognized dairy work from the ground up. She also, within 2 days of arriving, had sized up Silas with the frank evaluation of a younger sister who loves her sibling and is not pretending otherwise. On the 3rd evening, while they were washing up after supper and Silas was outside in the fading light, checking on the new fence Cobb had put in along the east pasture, Ruth said, without preamble, "He's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Eliza said. Ruth thought about it with honest effort rather than giving the polite answer. "Someone who looked like he was doing you a favor," she said finally. "Like he knew he'd done something generous and wanted you to know he knew." Eliza was quiet for a moment, her hands in the wash water. "He doesn't do that," she said. "That's the thing about him. He sees what needs doing, and he does it, and he doesn't hold it over you afterward." Ruth looked at her sideways. "You know that's not normal, right? That's not how most people work." "I know," Eliza said. "I spent about 2 months assuming there was a catch." "Was there?" "No." She rinsed a plate and set it on the drying rack. "There wasn't." Ruth nodded slowly, the nod of someone updating their understanding of a situation based on new information. "Good," she said. Then, "You're happy." "I am," Eliza said. "It's strange. I keep checking it, like it's going to turn out to be something else. But it keeps being what it is." "Stop checking it," Ruth said, practical as always, and picked up her drying cloth, and that was the end of the conversation about it, which was the right amount. Ruth left at the end of August with 3 jars of Eliza's butter packed in her trunk and a standing invitation to come back. And the ranch went back to being the 2 of them, and the hired men, and the 5 dairy cows, and the work that was always waiting, regardless of what else was happening. The first autumn of their marriage was not easy. Autumn on a working ranch with a growing dairy operation is not supposed to be easy. It is the season of preparation, of stocking what winter will consume, of making every decision twice because the wrong one in October cost you through March. Eliza and Silas disagreed genuinely and sometimes sharply about the pace of expansion. She wanted to move faster. The numbers supported it. The demand was there. Farwell had told her twice he could move more product than she was currently supplying, and the hotel account was reliable enough now to build on. Silas was more cautious, which she understood as a genuine position rather than timidity. He had seen operations expand past their infrastructure and pay for it across multiple bad seasons. They argued about it across the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening that started at supper and ran 2 hours past it, both of them with the ledger open between them and neither of them willing to concede the ground before they'd walked it thoroughly. At one point she said something sharper than she meant, and she knew it when she said it and kept going anyway, which she was not proud of. He didn't deflect it or argue back in kind. He just went quiet in a particular way that told her she'd landed it, and he was absorbing it, which was somehow worse than if he'd fired back. Later, after the argument had resolved itself into something workable, slower expansion than she wanted, faster than he'd originally proposed, with specific benchmarks that would trigger the next phase, she said, "I was harder than I needed to be earlier." "Yes," he said. No argument. "I'm saying so," she said. "I heard you," he said. And that was all either of them said about it, and the next morning was the next morning. She did not pretend this was comfortable. It was not always comfortable. She had a temper that ran hot under her controlled exterior, and she knew it and worked to keep it from getting ahead of her reasoning, and sometimes it got ahead of her anyway. He was not always right and did not always admit it on the schedule she would have preferred. There were evenings when she could feel him working through something he hadn't finished working through, and she had to leave him to it rather than pressing, which required more patience than she naturally had. But none of it was the kind of difficulty that means something is fundamentally wrong. It was the ordinary difficulty of two strong-willed people building something together, which is supposed to have friction in it. The friction meant they were both actually there, actually present, not managing each other from a careful distance. She would take that over careful distance every time. Winter came again. The second winter was different from the first in almost every way that mattered. The barn was full and properly supplied. The larder was full. The ledger had 2 complete seasons of data in it, and the numbers told a story she could follow, compare, project forward from, with something approaching confidence. She was not surviving the winter. She was spending it in a life she had built, working it, at home in a way she hadn't been at home anywhere since before Thomas died. She thought about Thomas that winter, not with the constant low-grade pressure of the first year after, but in the quieter way of someone who has moved through grief to a place on the other side where the person you lost can exist in your memory without occupying the whole room. She thought about what he would have made of all this, the dairy operation, the new barn, the man she'd married who fixed things without mentioning it. She thought he would have liked Silas. She thought he would have approved of the butter sales in a way that had more to do with being proud of her than with the money. She thought he would have been relieved that she had not gone under. She had shown Thomas's letter to Silas in November of their first year, on an evening when the time for it had simply arrived the way some things do, without a particular announcement. She'd handed it across the kitchen table, and he'd read it without changing his expression, and then he'd folded it carefully the way she always folded it and handed it back. "He loved you," Silas said. "Yes," she said. "He did." "Good," Silas said. One word said with complete sincerity and without a single layer of complication underneath it. Good, because being loved well and loving someone well is something to be glad of, always, regardless of how the story continues or what comes after. She had loved him specifically for that response in the moment he gave it, and she loved him for it still. She tucked the letter back in its place and they'd moved on to other things, and that was all, and it was enough. On a Sunday evening in December of their second winter, Silas told the story of Eliza's arrival at the supper table. He told it to Cobb and Reyes and a new hand named Daltrey, who had come on in the fall and was the kind of man who did the work of 2 and spoke at roughly half the rate of 1, which Eliza had decided she found admirable. Silas told the story plainly, the way he told everything: the knock on the door, the woman and the cow, the offer she'd made, the counteroffer he'd made. "She offered you the cow for a room?" Cobb said. "She offered me her cow, her labor, and everything she had," Silas said. "And I told her I didn't want the cow." Cobb looked at Eliza. "How'd you take that?" "I thought he was setting up for something worse," she said. "She looked at me," Silas said, "like she was trying to figure out which particular type of trouble I was." "I was," Eliza said. "I had a whole system by then for categorizing the types of trouble." "What type did he turn out to be?" Reyes asked. She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "The type that isn't," she said. The table was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of people who have heard something true and are sitting with it rather than rushing past it. "I still have the cow," she added, in case that wasn't clear. Daltrey, who had said perhaps 8 words at the table across the entire fall, said, "That's a good cow," with the authority of a man who knows cattle, and everyone laughed, including Eliza, and that was the evening. Afterward, lying in the dark with Silas asleep beside her, she thought about the story the way you think about a thing that has happened to you and is also somehow still happening. She thought about the woman who had walked 8 miles in the snow with a cow and $11, and the letter from a dead husband tucked in her boot, arriving at a stranger's door with a proposition that assumed the stranger would want something she wasn't prepared to give. She had assumed the worst of him and been wrong. She had been wrong in a way that had cost her 2 months of suspended disbelief, 2 months of waiting for the catch, of cataloging his behavior for hidden motives, of holding herself slightly back from everything he offered because surely, no one just opened a door and gave someone a room and meant nothing by it. But that was what had happened, and the reason she'd been unable to believe it, she understood now, was not because she was foolish or broken. It was because she had learned, accurately and through real experience, that the world was not generally organized in the way Silas Boone was organized. He was, in this specific regard, unusual. Not perfect. She had ample evidence of that by now, across 2 winters and 1 full year of marriage and several arguments about expansion pace and at least one evening when he'd been wrong about something and taken longer than she'd have liked to say so. Not a man without limitations or blind spots or the occasional stubbornness that required work to navigate, but a man who understood, in his bones rather than as a learned principle, that you could help someone without requiring them to diminish themselves in return. That giving something freely meant giving it, not lending it at interest rates disguised as generosity. That the woman standing at his door in the snow deserved to keep her cow and her dignity and her plans, not as a reward for something she'd earned, but because she was a person, and that was the baseline. She had been treated with respect when she had nothing left to bargain with. That was the sentence she returned to, the one that sat at the center of everything. Not the room, not the paid taxes, not the barn expansion, or the dairy accounts, or the ring on her finger, or the child she was carrying now, which she hadn't told Silas yet because she'd only been certain for 3 days and was still turning the knowledge over in her hands like something she hadn't expected to be holding. All of it was downstream of that original single thing. The moment he'd said, "I don't want your cow, keep her, here's a room, no conditions," and had meant it. She would tell Silas about the baby in the morning. She had already decided how she would tell him, directly, the way she told him everything, without a production, but also without burying it in the practical details of something else. She would tell him at breakfast, probably, before either of them had gone out to the morning work, when they were both still in the kitchen with the coffee made and the day not yet started. She thought about what his face would do. She had become an expert in the small movements of his face. The slight shift that meant he was pleased, the different shift that meant he was worried, the almost invisible relaxation around his eyes that meant he had been uncertain about something and was no longer. She thought his face would do the third one and something else she hadn't seen exactly before, and she found she was looking forward to seeing what that looked like. She was 32 years old. She was the co-owner of a working ranch with a dairy operation that was outperforming the projections she'd written into the ledger 16 months ago. She had 2 accounts, 5 cows, a barn built to last, a husband who removed his boots at the door every single day without being asked and had never once made her feel like a tenant in her own life. She had a sister who wrote 15 questions at a time, and a cow who had outlasted everything thrown at them, and a child coming in the summer. She had lost a husband and a homestead and a year of herself that she would not get back. She had walked 8 miles in the worst winter she could remember with nothing to her name but a cow and a letter, and the unwillingness to give up. She had knocked on a stranger's door and been let in. None of it had been smooth. None of it had been the story she'd have written for herself if she'd been given a choice. Thomas's death had not been the story she'd have chosen. The debt, the drought, the cabin failing around her, Hatch's smile when he looked at Hope. None of it had been anything she would have chosen. But she had not been given a choice about any of that, and what she had been given instead was this: the life you make from what you actually have, rather than the one you planned to have when you thought you knew what was coming. She thought that life, the one made from what you actually have, was the more honest kind. It didn't have the clean lines of the planned version. It had the marks of all the things that had happened to it and all the decisions made in the middle of those things. When the choices were hard and the ground was uncertain and she'd had to move forward anyway because the alternative was stopping, and stopping was not something she knew how to do. She fell asleep sometime around midnight, with the snow starting up again outside. She could hear it the way you hear it when you've spent enough winters in a place. The particular quality of silence that means the air is full of something, and she slept soundly and completely, the sleep of someone who has worked hard and is home and is no longer waiting for the floor to drop. Spring came again, the way it always came, and then another winter, and another spring after that. The operation grew in the increments they'd agreed on, the benchmark Silas had proposed and she'd modified and they'd both committed to, and each time they hit one she wrote the date in the ledger next to the projection and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing gone according to plan, which was rarer and therefore sweeter for being rare. Their daughter was born in July of 1881, in the same kitchen where Eliza had first sat down with a cup of coffee and tried to find the trap in a fair offer. She had Thomas's eyes, the exact same gray-green, a color Eliza had thought was entirely his own, and was startled to see again. And Silas's particular set to the jaw, which in an infant was somewhat comic but would no doubt become formidable in time, and a disposition that announced itself within the first 2 weeks as determined and easily annoyed by inefficiency, which Eliza recognized without particular surprise as her own. They named her Clara, after no one in particular, because she looked like a Clara and neither of them could explain that better than that. Hope met Clara at approximately 6 weeks old, when Eliza brought the baby to the barn for the first time on a warm August morning. She held her just outside Hope's stall and let the cow take a long, considering look, the dark eyes with their almost thoughtful quality moving from the baby to Eliza and back. And Hope made the small sound she made sometimes that was not quite a moo, more like a comment under her breath, and then turned back to her hay, apparently satisfied. "That's Hope," Eliza told Clara, who was looking at the cow with the unfocused intensity of an infant taking in something large and new. "She's the reason we're here." It was not a simple sentence. It was not entirely true in the literal sense because the reason they were here was more complicated than a cow, was a whole sequence of decisions made in desperation and difficulty and the occasional moment of terrifying trust. But it was true enough. Hope had been the thing she'd had to offer. Hope had been the thing she'd kept. And in keeping her, Eliza had kept something of herself that might otherwise have been lost in the transaction, the part that believed she deserved to keep what was hers, to arrive at a stranger's door and still walk away with her dignity intact. That was the lesson she would give Clara, when Clara was old enough for lessons. Not the romantic version, not the story of a widow saved by a good man's generosity, which was too simple and gave the wrong impression of where the agency had lived. The real version, that she had saved herself with the tools available to her, including the tool of knowing when to accept help, and understanding that accepting help was not the same as surrendering yourself. That the hardest thing she'd learned in that year was the difference between those two things, and that learning, it had cost her months of suspended disbelief and a great deal of exhausting internal argument, and had been worth every bit of it. That you could knock on a stranger's door with nothing left and still be someone. That being treated with dignity when you had nothing left to bargain with was not charity, it was just the baseline of how people deserved to be treated. And the fact that it felt like a revelation said something about how rarely it happened and how much it mattered when it did. Hope lived to 14. She died on an April morning in the corner stall with the eastern light coming in, the meltwater running off the barn roof outside, the year turning again the way years do. Eliza sat with her for the last hour, talking about nothing in particular the way she always had. And when it was over, she stayed a while longer in the quiet of the barn, just being in a place where she had spent thousands of early mornings and which held that accumulated time the way good places do, in the walls and the smell and the quality of the light. Then she got up and went back to the house and started the morning because there was work to do and she was still there to do it, and that had always been the whole of it. Constance and Ruth and their daughters filled the barn. The dairy operation became what the ledger had said it could, and then exceeded it, and then the ledger was replaced with a newer one, and then that one too. Cobb stayed for 11 years before retiring. Reyes bought his own land and came back as a neighbor rather than a hand, which suited everyone better. Mrs. Gale at the hotel retired, and her niece kept the butter arrangement because consistency is its own recommendation. And 6 years of Monday deliveries before 10 is a form of trust you don't walk away from lightly. Clara grew up in the barn and in the kitchen and in the pages of every ledger she could find, which she filled with her own calculations from the age of about 7 onward, in the cramped, decisive handwriting of a person who has learned that numbers are a form of argument and intends to win arguments. She was, as predicted, formidable. She was also kind, in the specific way of someone who has watched kindness practiced without performance for their entire life, and has therefore internalized it as simply the way things are done, rather than as a virtue requiring effort. On winter evenings, when the snow came and the house held against it the way it always held, Silas would sometimes tell the grandchildren, the ones who came eventually, in the fullness of a life built long enough to have grandchildren, about the day a widow had arrived at the gate with her last cow on a rope and a proposition he'd had to turn down and a counteroffer she hadn't been ready to believe. And Eliza would listen to him tell it, and she would correct the details he got wrong, which were the same details every time. He always said she'd knocked 3 times, she had knocked twice, and she'd told him that enough times that she suspected he was doing it on purpose. And she would add the parts he left out, which were the parts that had happened inside her, the fear and the suspicion and the months of waiting for the catch that never came. And when she told those parts, she didn't soften them. She didn't make past Eliza braver or more gracious than she'd been. She told them about the woman who had sat on the edge of a narrow cot in a borrowed room and been grateful for the warmth and suspicious of the reason for it simultaneously, because that was the truth of it, and the truth of it was the point. "Were you scared?" Clara's oldest asked once, with the direct curiosity of a child who has been told honesty is not optional. Eliza thought about it the way she always thought about things, all the way through, before answering. "Yes," she said. "I was scared the whole time, but I went anyway." The child considered this. "Because you had to?" "At the beginning," Eliza said, "because I had to. And then later," she paused, "because I wanted to. Because it turned out there was something on the other side of the scared worth getting to." She looked across the table at Silas, who was watching her with the steady gray-green eyes she had been looking into for a decade and a half, and which still, on occasion, said something to her that she didn't need words for. Outside, Wyoming did what Wyoming always did, which was be enormous and indifferent, and very cold in the winter, and briefly, violently beautiful in the spring, and completely uninterested in the stories people told inside the houses built against it. But inside the ranch that had held against 17 winters, in the kitchen where everything had begun and continued and would continue past anything either of them could see from here, the lamp burned steady on the table and the fire held in the stove, and the grandchildren were growing up in the warmth of something built from nothing, from an $11 widow and a quiet bachelor and one Jersey cow who had outlived almost everyone's expectations, which was, by any accounting that mattered, more than enough, which was, in fact, everything.